One of these mornings, one of these mornings, it won't be very long. They will look for me, and I'll be gone. One of these mornings, one of these mornings, one of these mornings, it won't be very long. They will look for me, and I'll be gone. One of these mornings, it won't be very long.
This is Fifth, and you're watching the XJW Fifth YouTube channel. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Ben. Ben is a former Jehovah's Witness, also a former elder and pioneer. He even worked with the writing desk in the Australian branch of Jehovah's Witnesses, and several of his articles were actually published in the Watch, Turn, Awake magazine. So, Ben, first of all, I just really want to welcome you to the channel, and thank you so much for taking time out to speak with me.
Thanks, Fifth. It's a pleasure to be on your channel. I'm looking forward to having a good chat with you.
Likewise. Thank you very much. Let me ask you a little bit about your background with Jehovah's Witnesses. What was your introduction to the religion?
Sure. So my parents were introduced to it when I was about 8 years old. My father was a window dresser, setting up shop displays. So, of course, most pioneers being window cleaners, he came across the witnesses all the time, and he eventually invited one back to the house and started studying. My mother was reluctant at first. She gave the witnesses a really hard time, but eventually she started studying as well, and I think they got baptised around 1978. So from that point on, I grew up in that culture. My father was never a serious sort of witness. I think for him it was more he liked the people. He was very social and gregarious. I don't think he ever really took it that seriously. I know when he studied with me, he never took my study very personally. So I kind of had to study for myself. So in my teenage years, I was very studious. I'd read a lot. But my dad was pretty casual about it all. He used to even fall asleep in the study that he had with me. But I was a very serious young person. I made a friend with another older brother in the congregation, and we used to even study old books together, get right into all those old meaty things with all the types and the anti-types and all the heavy prophecy stuff. So that was the kind of person I was. And so at 14, I decided to get baptised, and even from that young age, I had instilled into me the goal of pioneering. I had a few older brothers that sort of mentored me and really sort of instilled those goals into me. So I was a very serious-minded young person, never got into any trouble, and baptised very young. Then about 18, I met my future wife. She moved into our congregation from a northern coastal congregation here in Australia. And 19, I was married. So that's how it all started.
I see. Now, I would imagine, because you already have mentioned that you were very goal-oriented, even from a very early age, I would imagine you were reaching out for even more privileges at that time. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. So, of course, I was hoping to be appointed as a ministerial servant, and the brothers indicated to me that they were looking at me in that way. Unfortunately, my courtship to my future wife sort of threw a spanner in the works there. They view my wife as kind of a boy chaser or a cradle snatcher or something. She moved into our congregation, and straight away she's sort of after one of their spiritual boys, as it were. And I just remember our courtship. It should have been kind of the happiest time in your life, but the elders at the time made it really miserable for us, because we couldn't do anything right. If we were seen holding hands, we were straight away taken out to the back room and counselled. Everything we did, we were counselled for. They just interfered with everything. Eventually it got so bad that the circuit overseer even got involved. To his credit, he actually pulled the elders aside and said, "Hey, brothers, look, if the parents are approving, just stay out of it, mind your own business." So I thank them for that, but I just remember what a miserable time it was, just not being able to have a natural courtship, just because everything you did was so micromanaged and everything was observed and criticised and counselled. Anyway, we got married eventually, and then the brothers came to me and said, look, we'd like to make you ministerial servant, but seeing as you just married, we'd like to give you some time to settle into marriage, which I thought was a good and practical thing, so I accepted that. But then they made me ministerial servant, so I would have been about 20, 21, early 20s, I can't remember exactly. And then that sort of opened up some strange things for me, and I guess through my story I'm going to be mentioning a lot of things that probably should have made me think about the organisation on a deeper level, should have made me question things, but I just sort of suppressed it all and ignored a lot of things. So I found being a ministerial servant in that congregation I grew up with very tough, because our presiding overseer, as they were called in those times, he was one of those really old school elders that sort of felt the congregation was his congregation, like he owned it. He was the chief, and we were the Indians, and so there was again this very very strict control over everything, how everything was done. There was no freedom of opinion or how you might carry out certain tasks. But, I coped with that, and I thought he was a bit of a Hitler in a sense, and eventually when the opportunity came up to move, I took that opportunity and got out of that congregation. Also because I thought it was good to move away from where you've grown up, where everyone views you as just a sort of young kid, to establish your own identity, I thought was important too. I progressed well. I was being given public talks as a ministerial servant, so I think I'd made good progress there. But the opportunity came up to move to another Kingdom Hall, where there was a Kingdom Hall flat available. So they were looking for a pioneer to move into that flat, and we jumped at that opportunity as a newly married couple.
I see. Okay, so once you moved into that flat and, obviously changed congregations, being able to be perceived perhaps in a different light than you had been previously in your home congregation, what happened? How was your time there at that congregation?
Okay, so part of the reason for moving was, as I said, to get away from the this very controlling elder. And unfortunately, what happened was it was a bit of the out of the frying pan into the fire scenario. So when we moved into the new congregation, it was all lovely. We were welcomed so warmly. The presiding overseer there said, how much he appreciated having us there, but that only lasted for a very short time, and then his true colours came to the fore, and I realised that he was an even worse man than the man I'd left. I have to put this in context and say that, I've worked with many, many wonderful elders over the years, so I don't want to portray a wrong picture. Many of these elders I've worked with have been very loving, very genuine men, but over the time there has been some real bad ones, some bad eggs in that mix, and this one was probably one of the worst. So just to give you sort of an idea of how he ran the congregation, it was really like with an iron fist. Everything was controlled to the minutest detail. And again, we used to get in trouble for the slightest things. So it might be we had an anniversary party for someone in the congregation, and he'd come up and grill me and say, "You can't have anniversary parties. The society doesn't agree with them." And I'm like, "Well, where does it say that?" And then he'd write letters and just make stuff up and say the society says this and that. So any of his personal opinions, he'd use the society and say, that's what was behind his opinion. There was another instance where my wife, she wanted to do something fun for the kids in the congregation, so she thought, well, let's do a drama with the kids. We'll use one of the recorded dramas. We'll hire a community hall. We'll get the brothers to make up costumes, and it'll be a real fun school activity in the holidays for all the kids. As soon as this elder heard about it, he again straight away ran to the hall flat to grill us and say, "You can't do that, the society doesn't approve of these kind of things. You dare not be doing it in the Kingdom Hall." And we reassured him that no, we weren't going to do it in the hall. But everything was just, it was just so hard to get anything done or anything nice and joyful. There was such an oppressive atmosphere in that Kingdom Hall. And then, of course, being a person who wanted to create a sense of community and a sense of joy in the brothers and sisters there, I was always trying to do things and always getting myself into trouble with this particular elder. And there was other things too, like I remember a time where a sister had this emotionally abusive husband, and at one point it got so bad that he basically kicked her out of the house, threw all the clothes and stuff on the lawn and locked her out of the house. And she was good friends with my wife, so she called my wife and we went and got her, and we invited her to stay with us for the night just until she got herself sorted out. And again, as soon as this elder found out he was around to our place, grilling us, telling us how inappropriate it was because we're interfering in their marriage. And all we were doing was just this humanitarian thing. The sister was out on the street and we just gave her somewhere to sleep for the night, and we were sort of punished for it. But it sort of all came to a head at one point where there was a couple of other ministerial servants in the congregation that were also feeling that, this just wasn't right, the way he was doing things and oppressing everyone. And one particular was an ex-elder who'd moved in and was a servant, and so he had a lot of experience, and he also could see that this was just not right. So 3 or 4 of us, I think it was, we decided we needed to do something. We thought, God's Spirit wasn't working in this congregation, and we didn't feel like we could talk to him because he would just go nuts at us. We didn't feel like we could talk to any of the other elders because they all just seemed to be under his control as well. They just seemed to be his yes men, as it were. So we decided the only thing we could do was go to the circuit overseer. So there was a circuit assembly coming up, and we all went to the circuit overseer, and we explained what was going on in the congregation. We explained how we felt about it. The circuit overseer sort of thanked us for that and opened up an investigation. And I remember how crazy that whole assembly was. The whole weekend was just interview after interview. So what they did was the circuit overseer got the district overseer involved, who was serving that assembly, and the two of them got each of us in turn on our own separately and just grilled us for hours on end about the situation. And after they interviewed us all, then they sort of went back and interviewed us all again based on the other information they'd obtained. So initially we thought, well, this is positive, the society is listening to us and they were going to do something about it. But of course what happened was that it all just went back to him, and I'm sure the circuit overseer, gave him feedback and some counsel. I don't know what was said to him, but nothing was actually done about it in any practical way. So the fallout from it was that I guess maybe because I was sort of one of the chief instigators of it, he really directed his animosity to me even further. So at the time, as I said, I was doing public talks. I had my own book study group. I was almost doing everything an elder would be doing. And all that was taken off me because I'd gone behind his back and acted disloyally. So basically he dissolved the group I was in. He put me in his book study group where he could keep an eye on me and keep me under control. And this is the bizarre thing, Fifth. I was not removed as a ministerial servant, so I was still an appointed man, but I was treated like a disfellowship person for all intents and purposes. So he wouldn't let me take the field service group. I was barely allowed to answer. When I did answer, he just sort of snarled at my comments and looked at me disdainfully. I wasn't allowed to do anything, so I had no privileges anymore, even though I was still a ministerial servant. It was like I was put in the naughty corner, as it were, for speaking up against him. And I can't remember exactly how long this lasted, but I think I was in his group for a year or two. And the whole time I just had to sort of put up with it and think, well, just wait on Jehovah. This will get sorted out. It just went from bad to worse, really. Eventually, a special pioneer elder was sent to the congregation, and then it finally was sorted out. And what ended up happening was that virtually the whole elder body was removed as elders. A couple of other new brothers moved in along with this special pioneer brother. And so at the time, again, that appeased my doubts and my concerns. I thought, yeah, this is, even though it took so long, this is evidence that Jehovah eventually fixes things up, that he's really in control. So a mental conditioning remained for still a long time, even though that experience was just horrendous. There was no evidence of God's Spirit working in that congregation at all, but I thought now it had been fixed. And then not long after that, then I was appointed as an elder myself at around the age of, I think it would be about 27, 28 I was at that time. So what happened then was interesting because so for a while I served with that special pioneer brother who was a very good brother. We're still actually very good friends. He moved on from the congregation after a short while. And then a new presiding overseer had to be appointed. Now, the interesting thing is that there were two very experienced elders there, but they didn't get on. They both had very strong personalities, and I think if either of them had been appointed the presiding overseer, there would have been a lot of tension and drama because of the other one disagreeing all the time and not supporting the leadership of the other brother. So, as crazy as it seems, I, as the youngest elder on the body, was appointed as the presiding overseer. Not because of any skills or experience on my part, but literally because I was sort of a compromise candidate. I was the one who could maybe keep the peace between these other strong-minded brothers. So I was kind of really thrown in the deep end, in a sense.
Sounds like it.
Being overseer as at a very young age.
I see. So obviously that would have been a lot of responsibility, even being an elder, at 27 and all of the duties you would have had at that point, in addition to being married and all of that. That was, a lot on your shoulders. What was that experience like for you? How did things proceed from that point forward?
It was good for quite a while. As I said, those brothers were good brothers. They, as I said, there's been a few bad elders I've worked with, but that team of elders were genuinely good men to work with. But being an elder is stressful, like just the amount of work, the amount of emotional energy. Because I was also living at the Kingdom Hall flat, because I was pioneering as well, it was like I was on call 24/7. So eventually that did wear me down, and I almost had what you might call a nervous breakdown in a sense. And I eventually moved out of that Kingdom Hall flat and to another congregation. But I guess the big thing that stands out to me from that time in my life was just being thrown into this whirlpool of committee cases after committee cases all the time. It was funny when I was first appointed as an elder and I got the keys to the filing cabinet, as it were, where we kept all our records. I was a bit shocked as a young elder to see, with judicial cases, they are always filed in particular yellow envelopes that were all sealed. And so the first time I went into this filing cabinet, there must have been, 30 or 40 of these yellow folders, and they were thick with notes, just all the judicial cases over the decades in that congregation. I just thought, wow, there's just so much stuff here. And that didn't stop. During my time as an elder there, I served on, I don't know how many, but it just seems like every few months there was another judicial case. And that's probably one of my big regrets now, looking back, that some of the ways we handled those cases. I mean, at the time, we were following policy and procedure. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. But looking back now, I can see that some of the decisions I made really affected families, tore families apart in a sense because of the shunning that followed. I've tried to now go back and find those people and apologise as much as I can for the part I played in some of those things. There's one particular case that really still weighs heavily on me because I've never been able to find the man, and he was a good friend of ours at the time. We used to be around at their place for dinner every week. He had a young family with young kids. We got on really well with them, and anyway, he was disfellowshipped for the most minor of things, you know, and the only reason he was disfellowshipped because it happened a couple of times, and we were following procedure, and the book says, you know, if it's more than one occasion, then you have to question their repentance. But of course, we had no idea whether he was repentant or not. You can't judge that in a person. We're just following procedures. So he was disfellowshipped, and that was the end of that friendship, of course, for me. And I don't know what happened with his family, but I presume that he hasn't seen his kids for many years. Certainly broke up that family, and to this day it makes me really sad that I had a part in it. So there were many cases. There was also a case of child abuse. So again, I was only in my early 30s, I think, when I got that one. So again, very inexperienced. I didn't know how to handle that. It was a very difficult case. Luckily, it wasn't a severe case. It was more sort of the early stages of inappropriate touching. It wasn't a full-on child rape or anything like that. But still, looking back now, I can see how ill-equipped we were to handle it. We did what we're supposed to do, which was to ring the branch office, and they gave us some guidelines. We followed those procedures. The man stopped attending meetings, so we didn't really pursue him in the sense of taking judicial action or anything. We just sort of let the matter rest. The thing I deeply regret is that we didn't really give the victim the support that she would have needed. We didn't encourage her to go and get counselling. All we really did was, for a few meetings, just check on her to say, are you okay? Are you doing all right? Read some scriptures to her. And that's all we did. There was no long-term help. And years later, that all came to a head because she actually decided to do something about it herself. So she started legal proceedings. So I got a call last year when I'd already left the organisation from one of the elder who was actually the chairman of that committee. And it was interesting now I could see from the other side of the coin just how things proceeded from his point of view. So he rang me up and he told me, look, the police are going to call me about this case. We have to make some statements. We may have to go to court and testify. Yeah. But what really struck me was that this elder, his chief concern was that we got our stories matching. We got our stories straight. So that's the reason he was ringing, to give me a heads up. He basically told me what he had told the police, and he wanted to make sure that I was going to tell the police the same thing. And his chief concern was that we looked good to law enforcement, that it looked like we handled everything correctly.
And what he was suggesting as far as, the statement that would be given, was it true?
No, I didn't agree with it. I don't think. I mean, we handled things correctly in that we followed procedure, but I didn't agree that we handled things correctly from the point of view that I now have in hindsight.
Sure.
I don't think we could have done anything different at that time because we were only doing what we knew how to do. But looking back on it, I could see that we didn't handle things properly, and I wasn't prepared to say that we did. So when I went to the police, I gave them quite a different statement, and I told them how I felt from my current perspective. But That went to trial, and then the man was dealt with, and he was found guilty, and so that all turned out well. But yes, just really opened my eyes up to the fact that my other elders on that case were more concerned about how the organisation looked versus what we did for the victim.
How long was that period of time from when you were made aware of the allegation or the reporting of the inappropriate touching to when the police ultimately got a hold of it and pursued that case legally?
That's a good question, and that's why, in hindsight, it really concerned me, because this case happened in around 2003, 2004. I can't remember the exact year, so it would have been well over 10 years ago before it actually came to court. So, in that time, there's no telling what that man could have gone on and done. And again, our concern was he wasn't part of the congregation anymore, so we felt, okay, the young ones in our congregation weren't in danger. We weren't at all concerned about what he might be doing to kids outside the congregation. I don't know. I never even thought of that at the time. It didn't even come into my consciousness. Of course, now it does. Now I just see, well, we should have gone and reported that to the police, because they might have been able to do something much earlier, which may have prevented him abusing other children. So I don't know if there were any other cases. That certainly didn't come out in the trial, and hopefully that was a one-off case. But as we know with pedophiles, it is a sickness that usually doesn't stop at one case, does it? So that really disturbs me that in following those procedures we did, and never putting that to law enforcement at the time, what could have happened in those intervening years.
So you had that case, and you said several other difficult judicial cases at that time, but that didn't throw you too far off balance, right? You continued plugging along, continued serving as an elder, and eventually even attained higher privileges. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. So any sort of doubts I had or whatever, just sort of shoved under the rug. Just carried on serving loyally, again, being a very serious-minded elder. So eventually I was giving talks on the circuit and district convention level. Also around that time, I had the privilege of joining the writing team and doing research for the society. So one of the elders who was in my congregation where I grew up, who sort of mentored me when I was younger, he was kind of the coordinator of that writing team that we had. Because where I live, we have the National Library here, and so the writing desk in Bethel would often use us to do a lot of research here, because we had access to the materials and the library here and all the journals that we needed. So this brother who took me under his wing, as it were, he encouraged me to start doing some research for him. So eventually I was sort of invited to become a part of what they called the writing team. And we used to work along with the writing desk at the Bethel here in Australia. So I'm happy to tell you a little bit about that.
Sure.
I think it's an area that people probably are not really aware of how it all works.
Right.
If people are interested to know how these articles get written. So what would happen is sometimes we would get an outline from the society, and we'd be asked to research and write that article. But more often than not, our main purpose was to actually come up with ideas for the society. So we would talk amongst ourselves, talk to circuit overseers, have our ear to the ground as to what, things happening in the congregation, and see what concerns the brothers had. And we would come up with an idea for an article. So then what would happen is we'd put together like a one-page brief or one-page outline, just outlining the main points of the article and what the sort of thrust of it would be. Then that would get sent to the the Australian branch, who then sent it on to the Brooklyn Bethel, and then we'd wait for their approval. So they'd send a document back saying, it might say, no, we don't want that article at the moment, but more often than not, they'd like the idea and they'd say, yes, we give you approval for this article to be written, and they would give us direction as to what the article, where the article would be used and how big it would be. So they might say, well, this would be a 2-page article in Awake magazine, or this might be an 8-page cover series in the Watchtower. So they would sort of direct how they wanted that article. And often they would have other brothers in other writing teams around the world also at the same time working on a similar subject, and then they would often combine the 2 articles or the different amounts of research into one article. So that's kind of how it worked. Then once we got the approval for the article, then we'd get stuck into research. So we sort of had an idea of what we wanted to say and the points we'd want to make. We'd go and research and find sort of material or evidence to support the things we were trying to say, support the arguments we were trying to make. And this is where I learned, looking back now from my perspective, just how poor the society's academic credibility is, in a sense. So at the time, I was very impressed by the thoroughness of how we did things. So even just for a couple of pages in a magazine, we would send in a very thick binder of all the photocopied articles that we'd researched and that we were quoting from, and it all looked very thorough and academic. But looking back now, I can see it wasn't, because what we were actually guilty of doing was just basically using confirmation bias all the time. So to give you an example, instead of, let's say we were looking at a particular issue and writing about a particular issue, instead of researching and finding out, okay, what are all the experts saying about this issue, for or against, what are both sides of the story, we had our particular angle that we wanted to present, and we were just looking to basically quote mine. So we're looking for a quote that would support our position, and pretty much just ignoring everything else that didn't support our position. So that's basically what I did as a researcher. I was basically quote mining. I was looking for something that I could use to support my argument. I wasn't looking for, where does the evidence lead? You know, what do the bulk of experts say is the case in this particular scenario.
I see. I have a question about that. So as you were doing this research and you were kind of just picking out things that went along with whatever it was that you were trying to say, which of course would have been in harmony with what the organization kind of already taught, did that ever bug you? Did it ever bother you to realize, you know what, maybe the context is really this, and maybe the rest of this article, besides that quote I took, is carrying another message?
No, it didn't, because at the time, I didn't understand. I didn't have the critical thinking skills at the time to understand what I was doing. At the time, I'd never heard of confirmation bias. I didn't know about these cognitive fallacies that we suffer from. So at the time, I saw nothing wrong with what we were doing. It seemed totally normal to me, and that was the training I got at the time. It was very minimal. I should have been taught how to assess context, how to understand what the author was saying. And looking back at the notes I got, the very brief sort of training I got, we were instructed to make sure that we were quoting in context, that we weren't misrepresenting the author. But again, that was like something on paper that we really didn't apply that well in practicality.
I see. So would it be possible for you to just give a specific example of a time where you were just looking for things to support the point that you were trying to make?
Sure. I'll give you an example. It was to do with a very sensitive subject. It was homosexuality. So this was in the early noughties. at the time there was this idea floating around that homosexuality was a genetic thing, that people were sort of born that way, so they couldn't help being homosexual. So we were writing an article to sort of investigate those kind of things. And of course, the thrust of the article would be that, it doesn't matter if you had genetic tendencies, you could still fight those things. It'd be like if you were genetically disposed to be violent or to be alcoholic, you could control those things. So it didn't matter if you had tendencies. But this idea that it was a genetic thing, I guess was maybe a little bit, could be potentially damaging to the society's position. So we were trying to suppress that idea as much as possible. So anyway, in the research, I was tasked to find out, what was the scientific evidence behind this? Was there a genetic factor? So I looked up a lot of the scientific journals, a lot of the studies that were being done at the time, and the evidence was not clear. The evidence was that there's definitely some kind of factor there that people do grow up from a very young age having this sexual identity where they're attracted to the same sex. So that was definitely clear. But what I did was, when I was looking at the studies, I found out that most of the studies were actually funded by organisations that supported gay rights. So I took that as meaning, okay, these studies are not valid. So I basically put the case forward that none of this science can be trusted because the funding comes from someone who's biased. And so that was basically the thrust of the article, that we just ignored all the evidence because the science couldn't be trusted because of where the funding came from. And to a point, that's a valid argument in the sense, yes, there may be some biases in the research and that needs to be taken into account, but we just ignored all of the actual data, all of the actual evidence that was uncovered because of this perceived bias that we couldn't actually prove was there. It was just that, the wrong people were doing the funding. So I think that's a good example of how we would find information that supported our argument, and even if we found evidence that didn't support it, we would try and write that evidence off in some way as not valid because it didn't fit with our viewpoint of the world.
That's very ironic because clearly the way that you guys were going about doing your research and, finding things to support your argument would have been very biased. But it's very difficult to make that correlation when you just assume that everything on this side is correct and this can't be called into question, but somebody's up to something on this side and they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes.
Well, when you think you have the truth, then you don't think you're being biased, or you don't think the bias matters because it's the truth. So whatever bias there is a right bias. Sure. It doesn't matter. The other thing I would point out is that I thought was interesting was we were directed to write to a certain audience. So the articles were written from the point of view of a sort of mid-grade high school, sort of a 14, 15-year-old level of reading. So that's what it was sort of targeted towards. So it seemed like very thorough and academic, but it was kind of dumbed down a little bit towards a sort of more teenage kind of audience. And we felt that was sort of more representative of the whole target audience, from young ones to older ones, that we were trying to approach. And it's interesting looking back now at the material the society is producing. I don't know how much has changed since then. I don't know if the direction is different because I'm out of the loop there now, but I would say that dumbing down process has just gone to an extreme now when I look at the material that's being produced. When I compare the articles that I was writing, which were, I guess, they weren't long-form journalism, as you might see in a proper academic journal, but when you did a cover series, at least you were sort of getting into some meatier aspects of the subject. Because you had 2 or 3 articles over maybe 8 or 10 pages where you could really develop a theme and get into more detail. And you compare that though to the older magazines from the 50s and 60s, it was much shallower, much less in depth in those times. But now it's gotten even worse. I mean, they've cut the size of the magazines to literally half, and there's no depth to these articles anymore. And in fact, what I notice is that most of the actual content now is charts, pictures, cartoons, illustrations. It is all just graphic in nature. The actual amount of text, I think, would probably be reduced to a quarter of what we would have actually written in terms of text for those old articles.
Right. So you're able to see that now with your current perspective, right? You see to what extent they're dumbing down the information, and many times that is a criticism of the articles, is that they speak to the audience as if they're children, and now it sounds like that was very purposeful in nature.
Yeah. The other thing too is that I remember society never liked to publish articles on subjects that they were uncomfortable with, or that could be in any way controversial. So I remember there was a couple of outlines I submitted which didn't get approved. One was an outline on alternative medicine. So I wanted to. It's something that always bothered me, and it's one of the things that helped me wake up later on was just how many of the brothers and sisters were always pushing these really strange pseudoscientific alternative remedies for things, whether it was homeopathy or chiropractic remedies, or just, I don't even know what half of them were sometimes, but there was one brother in our congregation that used to have a special machine that ionized water in a special way and made it into magic water, if you like, and it could cure everything. So there was always these bizarre remedies, and all the brothers would jump onto these things, these bandwagons, and it really disturbed me because even though I didn't have critical thinking skills at the time, I was always passionate about science. I did very well at school with mathematics and science, and I could see that a lot of this stuff was pseudoscientific nonsense, and it disturbed me how brothers can really fall for all this stuff. Right. So I wanted to write an article just looking at the dangers of alternative remedies, and it wasn't going to be an article attacking it per se, just taking an approach of just weigh up the evidence carefully, just look into it a bit more thoroughly, don't just be gullible and accept these things. And I think at the time it was just too controversial. The brothers just didn't want to go anywhere near it. And I think because probably 90% of the brothers in Bethel were on some kind of alternative remedy at the time, including the brothers that probably had to approve that outline, so it was never going to get through. A couple of years ago, we actually finally, after all these years, had, I think, 1 or 2 paragraphs in a Watchtower study article warning about, the dangers of not looking at the evidence. It was literally 1 paragraph in a Watchtower, and I thought, finally, yes, they've addressed this issue. But, it could have been a whole magazine article. There was so much to say about that. There was another one I wanted to write about propaganda, because, again, even though I didn't have the necessary schooling, I forgot to mention. So when I was, excuse me, as a young person, when I finished high school, I, of course, started pioneering straight out of high school. I got a very good tertiary entrance score. I could have gone to university and done practically anything I wanted to, but, of course, I sacrificed all that for pioneering. And I was even interviewed at an assembly at the time. I was put on the platform and put out as a good example. Look at this young brother. He's had very good academic achievements, but he's sacrificing a career and a university degree to go and pioneer. again, now looking back from my new perspective, it shames me to think that I was used for propaganda in that way, and I might have influenced other young people to sacrifice an education to pioneer as well and follow my example. But anyway, going back to this thought of I was scientifically minded, but I didn't have the critical thinking skills because I never went to university or college, as I believe you call it in America. So, but I was interested in how we think and how we manipulate to think. So I wanted to do an article on propaganda. But of course, that article never got approved either
Big surprise.
Because I think the people in charge there realised that a lot of the points that were going to be brought out would highlight just how much the society actually uses techniques of propaganda to further their cause. So it was a little bit too close to home, I think. And again, recently I noticed we did have an article on propaganda, and it was kind of hypocritical and just really revealed society's own way of doing things. But again, they misquoted things in that article. They left important bits of the tools of propaganda out because I think they could see that people might add up two and two together and see that they were actually using those tools themselves. So this is what part of what helped me wake up later was to just see how cleverly manipulated the writing department is in misquoting, misrepresenting facts, misrepresenting evidence, and very carefully weaving a narrative that suits their agenda, which is part of what propaganda and indoctrination is, of course, all about.
Right.
At the time, I couldn't see it. Now it seems so obvious to me.
But it sounds like, even although you weren't able to see it completely, it did plant some seeds. It sounds like throughout your life, you've had moments that would have caused you to think twice. But it's interesting that being in the writing or being on the writing team of the Australian branch is what assisted you in ultimately making your exit. Would it be possible for you to basically explain that process? How is it that you finally came to that conclusion that this was not the truth, essentially?
Sure. Okay. So this is quite complicated. I wish there was kind of one thing I could point to and say, this is what really helped me wake up, or this is the doubts that I have. But I guess it was really a number of things that all coalesced together to sort of make that push. So it's interesting, actually, just before this happened, I even had a part on a convention about doubts. So my outline discussed about that, even elders sometimes have doubts about things, and I was instructed to even interview a couple of elders and pioneers as to what doubts they may have had in the past and how they dealt with those doubts. So even then, this is before I woke up, I was learning to suppress my doubts. I even had a part on how to do that at the assembly. We're acknowledging that we have doubts, but we learn to suppress them and ignore them and just shove them under the rug, as it were. So I guess what happened was, as I said, there was a number of things. So the whole alternative medicine thing was one thing. I'm a voracious reader, and I started reading some books on logical fallacies, critical thinking, again, because I've always been interested in that. I've been interested in how the brain works, how our thinking processes work. And what I started to see was that when I learned about logical fallacies like confirmation bias, selection bias, ad hoc arguments, arguments from authority, I could see how they all applied to alternative medicine. I could see why people were gullible in accepting a lot of those things and all the logical fallacies involved in how those things were sold and presented. And I started to see the connection with what I believed as well. And I started to think back to what I did in the writing department, and I could see that how much confirmation bias and special pleading and other problems were very much a part of my work. And I guess the reason I was starting to think a bit more deeply about it was at the same time I started to notice these really strange dogmatic statements being made in the study articles without any biblical support. So the brothers would say, this is what this means, and there'd just be no scripture attached to that statement. And that sort of got me thinking, why are they doing that? And then, of course, at that time we had the new generation understanding, the overlapping generations. So I think there was a statement in that article that said something like, Jesus evidently meant there were two groups of people, and this is how they explained it. And again, there was no scriptural basis for that. In times past, I remember whenever they'd come out with a new light or a new point, they'd spend the whole watchtower establishing and leading up to that point. So they'd be proving with scriptural references and context and everything. They'd put a lot of time into establishing this new idea. Mm-hmm. Some of these recent magazines, they're just, well, here's our new explanation, and just like, well, you just got to accept it. Just evidently that's what Jesus meant. There was no need anymore to provide context or scriptural evidence for anything. Mm. So that started to disturb me. Around the same time, we had that article on the types and anti-types. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yes.
Basically, they said, well, look, brothers, we just went totally overboard with this over the years. We're not going to say that anything's, say, type and anti-type anymore, except that when the scriptures actually say it is. Now, in one way that was disturbing, because as I mentioned, as a young person growing up, that's part of the truth that always fascinated me. All these intricate connections, these types and anti-types and these prophecies were something that I always was fascinated by, and that to me was like the deeper things of the truth. That was what made our understanding of the Bible so much deeper than Christendom's understanding. And now the brothers were saying, well, we're just throwing all that out now, like everything that made us unique and different, we're just throwing that on the scrap heap. And so that's where I sort of thought, well, I can't buy this idea anymore that this is sort of some progressive new light all the time. Right. And what particularly disturbed me about it was they didn't expand on the implications of what that would mean. So for instance, they gave a couple of sort of minor examples, but then when you think about it, just about every doctrine we had was based on a type anti-type thing. And one doctrine in particular is, of course, the prophecy in Daniel about the great tree and Nebuchadnezzar's rulership. And again, that was a type and anti-type for God's kingdom. And that's how we get to the whole 1914 thing with the chronology and everything. So for me, I sort of thought through the implications of getting rid of the types and anti-types. And I thought, well, that means that we can't use that tree, Nebuchadnezzar's tree, to prove the chronology that leads to 1914 anymore, because that's a type anti-type, and the Bible doesn't say that we should view it in that way. But of course, the brothers just avoided that subject entirely and didn't mention it, even though they said that we're not going to rely on types and anti-types anymore. So then I started thinking about, that got me thinking about the whole 1914, that we keep having to reinvent the explanation of what a generation means. And it occurred to me that we're just playing word games. We just keep reinventing what Jesus meant when he said this, when it should be obvious what he meant. He's the greatest man who ever lived. He's the greatest communicator. He's the great teacher. We had books called The Great Teacher, and yet we couldn't just take him at face value. He couldn't communicate as a great teacher what he actually meant. We keep having to reinvent it. So I guess that's where I first gave myself permission to think, now I need to go back and look at everything I believe and really test it properly. I really need to make sure that I'm not falling victim to some fallacy, to some confirmation bias. I need to go back to square one and reprove to myself all these doctrines.
Were you still working with the writing team at this time?
No,
Okay.
that stopped that stopped a number of years ago when I moved congregation, so we didn't discuss that. But after, I think I lived in that Kingdom Hall flat for 14 years, and as I said, it just ground me down. I was suffering emotionally, financially, many other ways. I just sort of had a nervous breakdown. So I moved to a new hall. I resigned as presiding overseer. I just went back to having sort of minimal privileges that I could cope with. I still served as an elder, but I gave up pioneering. I just sort of needed to lighten up all the things I was working on. So around that time, I'd also stopped working for the writing team. I just couldn't cope with it anymore. I couldn't find the motivation to do that work anymore. So I'd given that up.
I see. So at this time, although you weren't on the writing team, you were still serving as an elder when you were making all of these discoveries.
Absolutely. So it was also around that time that the Australian Royal Commission came out. That's why I said I can't pinpoint any one thing that woke me up, because it really was a whole range of things that all came together. So I remember watching the testimony of Jeffrey Jackson, and I was just dumbfounded. You know, I was expecting to see some amazing defence of the truth, and even when I was, as I said, I went back to all the things I believed, and I tried to reprove it to myself, not in the sense of trying to prove it false, but in the sense of I need to shore up my faith here. I need to reconvince myself of what I believe. I went in wanting to prove that it was true and did my best to prove it was true, but having the critical thinking skills to be aware of if I was just conning myself. And so the same thing when I approached the Royal Commission, I was really expecting to see some evidence now that, because at this time, this is the first time we'd seen the governing body members. We never used to even know who they were, and I used to be proud of that fact that we don't even know who these people are. They're not in the limelight. And of course, when they started JW Broadcasting, they did come out in the limelight, as it were, and we got to know them. Initially, that was good. They seemed like really nice and genuine, and it was nice to see them joke around and have fun, and they seemed like really down-to-earth people. But the more we start to see them, or the more that I start to see them, the more the reverse started to happen. So with Jeffrey Jackson's testimony, I was just appalled at how the lack of defence for what he believed in came out loud and clear, and how he dodged and evaded all the questions. And I felt that even in a couple of places he outright lied. I went to one of my colleagues, one of my fellow elders, and say, what do you think? Do you think he lied in these particular instances? And this elder said, no, I disagree. He was just being cagey, because what he said might be a lie in this country, but it might be valid in another country. The policies are different around the world, so he was having to hedge what he said to make it sort of internationally appropriate. And this is the sort of mental gymnastics that some elders were saying, that, he wasn't really lying, he was just being cautious, he was just, withholding information, he was using theocratic warfare, as it were. And they justified it to me by saying, well, apostates were feeding the Royal Commission all these things, they were out to get us, so it was appropriate that he wasn't upfront and honest with the Commission. And I was thinking, well, that's not right, that we're told to be obedient to the superior authorities. This was the superior authorities holding us to account on something, and they had a right to know this information. This wasn't like in Nazi Germany, where we could lie and withhold information about our brothers because they didn't have a right to know. No, this was a Royal Commission. This was a respectable and a proper thing for the government to be doing, and we should have cooperated. And Jeffrey Jackson actually said, yes, we want to cooperate, but that's not what he did in his testimony. I couldn't believe how many times he said, that's not my department. I have knowledge of that.
Right.
You know, he's a governing body member. Every bit of policy goes through him or one of the governing body committees. There's nothing, everything that I wrote in the writing department eventually went through his purview. He or one of the other governing body members had to approve every word of what we wrote before it got published. So I knew that. I knew that he would know every bit of policy. And besides being a governing body member, he was also an elder. So it wasn't good enough to say, well, you know, I don't know how the elders would handle this particular scenario, because he was an elder first before he was a governing body member. So he knows how elders do things, what procedures to follow. And I just couldn't believe how much he evaded and the questions and just ran around in circles. So that was a real disappointment to me. And then when I watched the testimony of other branch committee members, I saw them also evade and lie and misrepresent certain things. So that sort of all then tied in with the other issues I was thinking about. So basically what I did with all my doubts and the research I was doing, I did the right, well, I think I did the right thing. Again, I was still very loyal to the organisation at this time. So, you know, I hadn't read any apostate things. I had only, you know, when I looked up I started doing some research on 1914 and 607, and I wanted to, as I said, go back to the drawing board and look at the evidence for 607, the archaeology. Again, in a naive way, thinking, well, maybe the whole generation thing is not working out because we got the starting date wrong. Maybe 1914, there's something wrong with that. And so I needed to just check the chronology. And I used worldly secular sources. I didn't look at apostate things. I just looked at secular sources to try and work out what the evidence for all that was. And of course, you know what I would have found out, that there was no evidence for anything. You know, it just really came crumbling down. So again, I went to a fellow elder that I trusted, and one who was quite academically inclined, very intelligent man. And I discussed some of these issues with him, and he was initially quite helpful. And but what disturbed me was I wrote, he doesn't know this, but he actually, I guess, pushed me further down the track of questioning, because I wrote him a long email at one point, and I outlined in this email all the assumptions that we need to make to get to that chronology of 1914. There's a number of steps that's involved, obviously. It's very complicated. Most of the brothers would find it very hard to explain it all. And going back and looking at it, I realised that there were lots of leaps, lots of assumptions we had to make along the way to get to that point. And so I outlined all those to him. I think there were 7 or 8 of them in an email. And I said to him, brother, help me understand this. Why are these just assumptions, or is this solid evidence? Are these just a bunch of non sequiturs that don't follow, or am I missing something? And so he wrote back, and I think 2 of the points he referred me to a Watchtower article which I'd already read and decided really didn't answer the question. But what again shocked me was all the other points, he just said, yes, they're assumptions, but so what? That was his words, so what? So that just really blew my mind. I thought, okay, so here's a bunch of confirmation bias, a bunch of assumptions. There's no evidence for any of these steps. And here's this, intelligent elder saying, well, so what? Who cares? And that's really then, I guess, what pushed me into researching things further. So what happened after that was, as you can imagine, the more I'm learning, the more disturbed I'm becoming, the more I'm really realizing that this is a house of cards. It felt like I'd sort of pulled on this thread with the 1914 chronology, and everything was just coming apart underneath me because it was all tied in and related. So basically I went to my fellow elders and I said, brothers, again, I was very upfront. I was still at this time trying to save my faith in a sense. I said, brothers, look, I've got doubts about this doesn't add up. I was saying to them, so another thing that occurred to me at this same time to do with the child abuse issue was that I sort of came to the conclusion that, where's God's spirit in all this? What I put two and two together with was that I think, so in Australia, what came out from our own statistics in the Royal Commission, that there were 1,000 cases of child abuse and or allegations of child abuse, and I can't remember the exact breakdown, but I think it was like somewhere between 10 and 20% of those were appointed men, ministerial servants or elders. And then I realised, again, this sickness is not something that just, you don't get to 40 years old and suddenly become a pedophile. Like, this is a sickness that starts very young. Again, as an elder, I dealt with another case of abuse where it was like a teenage boy abusing an even younger girl. So I knew that this sickness happened from a very young age. So it occurred to me that there were a number of elders in the organisation that were appointed by Holy Spirit, but must have already been pedophiles at the time they were appointed.
Good point.
And that just hit me like a bolt of lightning. I thought, well, how could that possibly happen? Because, as elders, we go over the qualifications and we pray to God to help us identify what we can't see. We can't read the heart of this man. We don't know what's lurking in the background. All we can go is what we see by appearance's sake. And so the whole point of praying over the brother and talking it over with the circuit overseer and sending the recommendations to the society, the whole point of that whole procedure is supposedly to allow the Holy Spirit to make that appointment. The Holy Spirit is supposed to, put something in the mind of some brother along the way to say, hang on, I've got a bad feeling about this. We need to look into this more. There should be some warning sign the Holy Spirit should have given us not to appoint this brother. And that never happens, Dozens and dozens of these men, abusers, got away with things because of their position as elders and the position of trust they were given. And it occurred to me, how could the Holy Spirit allow that? How could Jehovah, who apparently protects his sheep, allow predators to get into positions of authority like that? So from that point on, I really started doubting that there was any spirit involved. And I started reassessing everything in my life because, again, over the years, I'd sort of seen Jehovah's hand in my life, as it were, but I realised that it was another form of confirmation bias. I was interpreting events in my life as if Jehovah had somehow done something for me, when in fact it was due to my own efforts. I realised when something good happens, it's because I worked towards it, or when something bad happens, it was because of failures on my part. But I'd interpreted certain events in my life as answers to prayers, or God doing something for me. And looking back now, I could see, again, it was just my interpretation, my biases coming into play. It wasn't reality. So anyway, getting back to the point, I went to the body of elders and I said, brothers, I'm having problems with all these issues. And, the first meeting was really nice. And again, these are brothers, I have to say, this team of elders I worked with, they were good men. And I still hold them in quite high regard on the whole. But, they were good. They were willing to listen. They were patient. They were kind with me for that first meeting. They even acknowledged that they too had some similar doubts, that they often struggled with similar things. But the upshot of the meeting was, well, they didn't have any answers to start with. They couldn't defend the questions that I'd raised. So because they didn't have any good answers, they just said, look, I think the expression they used was, you just got to park it, park all these doubts. So in other words, shove them under the rug. Just kind of ignore them, suppress them, and just keep doing what you're doing, trust in Jehovah, wait on Jehovah, all these platitudes that we get, and just kind of suppress all your doubts was what I was told. And looking back too, though, they were even willing to, I guess, again, misrepresent or lie about things. So I remember I was talking to them about the whole new light thing and how that didn't make sense, and how can we talk about old truth or new truth or whatever. And one of the brothers, who, again, very old, experienced brother who served at Bethel, he said, we don't use those expressions. We don't talk about new truth or old truth. And I started doubting myself. I thought, am I going crazy? I'm sure we use those expressions. But again, I trusted this brother. He was older, more experienced than me. And the brother said, we don't say that something is present truth. We talk about our current understanding of things. And I thought, no, that's not how we talk. But he flustered me. I thought I was going crazy. And then the very next day, the broadcast came out and a sister was interviewed, and she talked about receiving present truth and how much she delights in present truth. And I thought, there you go. And this brother just totally denied that we use those terms and think about things in that way. So anyway, I left that meeting and continued with my doubts and research. And then a couple of weeks later, we had the circuit overseas visits, and I discussed a few things with him out working with him in the territory, and we had our elders meeting. And I said at the elders meeting, brothers, there's just one more thing I'd like to bring up, if you'll allow me. And the thing I brought up, while I was talking about it, one of the elders was sort of Googling it on his iPad, and he found some commentary on it on the apostate website. And so straight away he sort of said, well, where did you get this from? Why are you asking about this? Did you get it from an apostate website? And at the time I said to him truthfully, because it was the truth, that no, this is just something that's come up in my research and something that didn't make sense and something I happen to know about. But from that moment on, it was almost like I could physically see the shutters come down in the room. Like if there were literal shutters in their brain and their eyes, I could virtually see that. And the whole mood in the room changed to, I was now no longer a welcome colleague. I was now almost like a dangerous enemy. And initially we discussed, I said to the brothers, look, I can't in good conscience teach some of these things anymore. I disagree with them. And initially they said, well, we just won't give you any talks on those subjects. That'll be cool. But as the discussion progressed, we sort of came to an impasse, and we I think mutually realised that this wasn't going to work, because I wasn't a team player anymore. I wasn't a company man, if you like, anymore. I wasn't willing to just do whatever the society told me to teach, what they told me to teach. So we mutually agreed that it would be best if I resigned. So I basically resigned as an elder that night, and I went to meetings for a few more weeks after that, and then I just stopped going to meetings. I couldn't stand sitting in anymore and listening to all this nonsense that I was hearing, all this unfactual, incorrect information, this misleading information. I couldn't stomach it anymore. So so I had to make that cut completely and go cold turkey and just leave.
I see.
There was also one other thing that happened in that meeting that really, I guess, confirmed my decision to leave was the right one, and it kind of pushed me over the edge, because even up to that last moment, I was still undecided as to whether I should resign or not. But what happened was we were looking at a young man as a potential ministerial servant, and the way the process works in an elders meeting is we go through all the scriptural qualifications, and we discuss the person, and then we look at his report card and discuss what he does in the congregation and how he meets up to the standards we're expecting. So anyway, this brother was well spoken of by all the elders. We had already agreed that we all supported his appointment as a servant. But the circuit overseer was looking at his report card and said, brothers, he's not getting enough hours. His average is quite low. And we tried to give the circuit overseer the extenuating circumstances. We said, look, his wife is going through all this stuff. They're trying to have a child. They're going through a lot of drama and emotional turmoil with that. We pointed out how much he does for the brothers in the congregation. When someone needs moving, he's always the first to help someone move. He's doing the accounts, he's doing the sound. He's so busy helping the brothers in the congregation. We feel, regardless of his low hours, that he's a spiritual man. His heart's in the right place. He's putting himself out to serve the brothers, like a young Timothy. And this is what shocked me. The circuit overseer said, well, what really counts is the hours. If he's doing all these other things, then maybe you should talk to him and get him to do less of those things so he's got more time for the ministry. I could not believe it. I could not believe we were judging a man based on numbers on a card, a man who does practical things for the brothers, helps the old sisters with their shopping, helps brothers move, shows so much practical love in the congregation, and we were telling him to stop doing all those practical loving things so that he could get more numbers on his report card.
Amazing.
And that for me just settled the whole thing. I thought, what am I doing here? Why am I part of an organisation that judges people not on the good they do, but on numbers on a card? And I thought, this is wrong. And that just really cemented my decision then in that moment to step down.
I see. So you said you continued going to the meetings for a couple of weeks, and at some point you stopped. Could you just explain what the process was once you stopped going to the meetings?
Sure. So at that point now, I decided there was a scripture that I read in Proverbs which says something along the lines of, he who's first to make their case seems right, but then you should cross-examine that and hear the other side of the story. So that's when I finally gave myself permission to actually read what would be considered apostate material in the sense. So in the 80s, when I was a teenager, I'd vaguely heard about this member of the governing body, Brother Franz, that was disfellowshipped, and it caused a bit of a drama at the time, and I didn't know anything about it. So I looked up his book. I found this book called Crisis of Conscience. And I thought, well, I'm going to apply Proverbs here. There's nothing wrong with doing that. God tells us to question things, to test things. He had recorded in Proverbs that you should cross-examine the first person. And I realised that, all my life I'd listened to one source of information. The society was the first person to ever teach me anything about everything. I thought, well, I need to hear the other side of the story. I need to cross-examine this story. And so reading Crisis of Conscience was when, I guess, is what brought it all together, and the scales just came off my eyes. That's the moment I wake. I remember closing the last page of that book and realising that my whole life had just changed in that moment. That's when I literally lost my hope, lost my faith, lost any sense of who I was, my identity. I just realised it was all built on a fantasy. It was all built on a lie, because he confirmed everything that I was feeling, that there was no Holy Spirit directing this organisation. He gave the proof, and I didn't just accept it, Fifth. I didn't just sort of suddenly go off and start believing apostate lies, as the society likes to portray it as. I mean, as you know, if you've read the book, he has documented everything. There's photocopies of all the letters he's referring to, the correspondence. Everything is documented. But that wasn't enough for me. in the book, he also mentioned other various people who were caught up in that big sort of purge, if you like, at Bethel. And some of those people are still alive. So I made the effort. Again, this was my training as when I was working on the writing department. You learn to check sources. You go back to primary sources. So I did that. I looked up these people. I Skyped with them on the other side of the world, and I interviewed them. And I said, can you corroborate what I've read in this book? You were there at the time. Let's hear your side of it. And I interviewed 2 or 3 of these people, and they all corroborated the story. So, again, I went to the source of people who were there and saw it with their own eyes. And that was terribly, terribly devastating for me, I have to say, at the time. Like, I've always suffered from depression and anxiety disorders, and I've sort of gone up and down with that over the years, but that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I literally bawled for days. You can ask my wife. I was just an emotional wreck. I had another nervous breakdown, I'm pretty sure. My wife was so concerned, she made me make an appointment with a psychiatrist. I'd never been to a psychiatrist before. I went to a few counselling sessions, and that helped me a little bit, but she wanted to make sure that whatever I was going through wasn't to do with any mental illness, and I was quite happy to agree with her that that could be a factor to what I was going through. And I wanted to make sure that my change in belief wasn't because I was going crazy, because, the society gaslights you in that sense, as they do make you feel like there's something wrong with you. You're the one going crazy if you don't believe it anymore. So we went to a psychiatrist, and he basically gave me a clean bill of health. He said, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just going through a stage where your thinking process has changed, and you need to follow it. You need to continue that. But there's nothing wrong with the way I was thinking. I wasn't being illogical. I wasn't being emotional. It wasn't a symptom of mental illness. It was just me actually thinking for myself for the first time in my life. Wow. And sort of deprogramming myself. So that was good to sort of just affirm as well for my own sanity. But that was a very difficult time, and of course it creates a lot of friction in a marriage. My wife is the one thing I don't regret about growing up in this organisation. She's been my rock, my support, and even though we disagree on many things now, she has stood by me and defended me in all this, and I just can't thank her enough for her loyalty towards me, even though she's still very loyal to the society as well. And it's been very hard for her now to go to meetings on her own. She thought she married an elder. She thought that's what her life was going to be, a certain way. And that pains me every day too, that I have to make her life difficult in that sense, but I can't do anything else. I can't live a lie. I have to be true to myself and who I am. And it's sad that it creates that conflict and division when there's 2 opposing philosophies like that. Mm-hmm. With the depression, as I mentioned, I'd always suffered from depression, but this was quite a bit more severe than what I experienced in the past. Mm-hmm. In the past, I'd never had any suicidal thoughts or anything like that. It was just a sort of vague kind of depression where you're just unmotivated and feeling miserable. But this really did hit me hard in the sense I started having suicidal thoughts. I'd literally have some days where I felt so bad. I just literally played out in my mind a scenario where I would drive my car into a tree or just do something insane like that. And of course I didn't. But I just wanted to mention that because you can really plummet to some serious depths of despair when your whole worldview is upended like that. When you have to face your mortality for the first time and realise that you're not going to live forever. That was just wishful thinking, and it changes your perspective on life. And the depression got so bad, but luckily with the help of counselling and my wife and other factors, I was able to get past that, which was good.
That's great. That's great to hear. And, I appreciate you mentioning that because it's so common, and we're starting to hear a lot of terrible stories. So it's good, that we're able to be open about that and take steps to try to deal with it, and just understand that many times that's a part of finding out that everything you believed and promoted your whole life is not what you believed it to be. So let me ask you about how you're dealing with all of that now. And I understand you had those thoughts and feelings that you just mentioned previously. How are you able to deal with it at this point?
Sure. So I think I've gone past the worst of things. I mean, you have good days and bad days, but I think generally I'm on the up and up now. I'm learning to cope with my mortality. I've learned to appreciate life in a way that I never appreciated before. I think previously you're always thinking, well, whatever's happening now in life doesn't matter because you're in like a holding room. You're waiting for the new system to come, and you're going to be able to enjoy lots of things there. So now I see life in a different way. I see every moment as so much more precious than I ever did before, because this is the only life I've got in that sense, and I have to make the most of it. So now I'm just trying to change my thinking patterns and trying to get out of that sort of rut of depression that you initially go through, and focusing on the more positive things of life and what I want to achieve in this life, because I still am the same person. As an elder, the reason I was an elder is because I wanted to help people. I want to make a difference in people's lives, and I still want to do that. I still want to make a difference in this world and help people make the world a better place. I can't do that anymore in a religious sense as an elder. So now I'm looking for ways in which I can help the community and support my fellow man in more secular ways.
Right. And that's great. That's a very good outlook to have. Just try to find practical ways to help people, which we were somewhat discouraged from doing in the past. Ben, I really appreciate you sharing all of that with me. Obviously, you had so many years of experience at high levels within the organization, and I appreciate you opening up and sharing that with all of us. I will ask you the same thing that I ask all of my guests. For those who are looking at these types of videos, perhaps for the first time, or just starting to have doubts and have built up the courage to watch videos of former Jehovah's Witnesses, what would you say to those people who have not yet decided what they're going to do?
I would say don't be afraid to explore the doubts that you have or the questions you have. Whatever you do, don't suppress them. I think that's emotionally damaging. It's not good. It's not a healthy thing for you to do. I think doubts are your mind's way of saying there's something that doesn't add up here, and you should listen to that. Not just suppress it, but you should explore and address it and come to some conclusion about it. So don't be afraid to look at both sides of an issue. Don't be afraid, because society likes to scare us and thinking that, outside information is somehow evil or satanic or whatever. I remember in my last elders meeting, I brought up something about just some kind of secular fact. I think I got it from Wikipedia. And the brother said, well, you don't know who wrote that Wikipedia article. Maybe Satan influenced them to write that. And so there's this kind of demonization of any information that doesn't come from the society. So, of course, that is ridiculous. Information in itself is not good or evil. It's just information. It's what you do with that. So I'd really encourage people to explore, question everything, research everything thoroughly, research both sides of any issue, and don't be afraid to come to your own conclusions. I'd also really encourage people to learn critical thinking skills, because I can see that's what kept me trapped in the organisation for years, because I didn't have the skills to evaluate the information I was given. I was fed all this so-called knowledge, but I didn't have the necessary skills to be able to deal with it properly and come to the right conclusions. So I really encourage people to thoroughly research their questions and concerns and doubts, and don't be afraid of where that leads you to.
That's great advice. I definitely appreciate you sharing that point of view. So, my next question has to do with those who have come to that conclusion that this is not the truth. This is not what they believed it to be at one point. And obviously, we both know it could be a very scary, very emotional time in our lives. May even have some of those dark thoughts. I know I've had them as well. What would you recommend, or what would your advice be, rather, to individuals who find themselves in that situation?
Okay, you need a support network. One of the one of the good things about being a Jehovah's Witness, even if even if what you believe might be wrong or the doctrines might be wrong, you have a community, a sense of community, a support network. And if you leave that, then all of a sudden you don't. You're on your own. It can be a very lonely thing. It's hard to cope with on your own. One of the reasons I decided to do this interview with you is because I wanted to add my story to the many others that are out there for people to realize that they're not alone. But I would encourage people to find or to reach out to other people in the same situation. It's good to read stuff on the internet, watch videos, but you still need that one-on-one personal connection with people. So what I've done is I've reached out to a number of people that have left, some other ex-elders who are in a similar scenario to me, and I've established some friendships with them. I've established a new circle of friends, and that has been so helpful to have that support network. When I'm having a bad day, I can just ring them and vent, and because we understand each other, we can really help each other out. So I'd really encourage people to replace the support net they had with a new one. You still need that human connection. I'd encourage people to get counselling or psychological help if they need to, because changing your worldview brings up all kinds of emotions and anxiety. So it's really good to be able to talk all those things through with someone who's sort of independent and not critical of you, and just work through all those issues. And you can come out the other side as a very healthy human being with a new way of looking at things, I think. At the end of the day, never stop questioning anything in life. Just maintain your curiosity. The minute you stop questioning is the minute you stop learning and growing as a person. So I just really want to encourage people to keep learning, keep educating yourself, don't put questions aside, keep gaining more knowledge, and just open up a whole new universe of things that you never experienced before when you're under that indoctrination.
So, with that, Ben, I would really like to thank you again for taking the time out and speaking with us about your story. I know it's not an easy thing to do, but it's very much appreciated. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Fifth. It's been a real pleasure to be with you and to get my story out there. And I hope it helps someone out there. I hope it helps at least one person to realise they're not alone. And if I could just mention, as I said, I think it's important to connect with people. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk to them and help them. I'll leave my contact with details with you, and I'd welcome anyone getting in touch with me if they want to talk about more of the issues that we've discussed.
That sounds great. Thank you very much again, Ben.
Thank you very much, Fifth, for having me on.